The house was no longer a home. For Alara, all 28 years of her life had been lived within its walls, but the spirit that animated it had departed with her father 6 months prior. Now it was just a collection of wood and nails, a property listed on a deed, and the deed was no longer in her family's name. Her uncle, a man who moved through the world with the quiet efficiency of an accountant, closing a ledger, had seen to that. He sat across from her at the polished dining table, a place of countless family meals, and slid a thin envelope across the wood grain. It was a sterile, bloodless transaction, a quiet expulsion, couched in the language of practicality. "The sale is final," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on a point just over her shoulder, as if she were a minor detail in a much larger, more important landscape. "The new owners will take possession on the 1st. You have until then." Alara did not speak. There were no words that could fit the hollow space that had opened in her chest. Grief was a familiar weight, a cloak she had worn since her father's heart had simply stopped. But this was something new. This was the cold, sharp edge of abandonment. She had known this was coming. Her uncle had never seen the value in the rambling old house, the sprawling workshop, or the legacy of calloused hands and honest labor her father had built. He saw only equity, liabilities, and the clean finality of a cashier's check. She did not cry. She did not plead. She did not rage against the injustice of it. Her father had taught her many things, and chief among them was the futility of arguing with the inevitable. He was a surveyor and a stonemason, a man who understood the unyielding nature of bedrock and the immutable truth of a plumb line. "You can't argue with gravity, El," he used to say, his voice thick with the dust of the quarry. "You can only build to accommodate it." This felt like gravity, a force she could not fight, only endure. The envelope contained $500. A final settlement, her uncle called it. An insult, she knew it to be. It was meant to sever the last tie, to absolve him of any further responsibility. She took the money, the crisp bills feeling flimsy and unreal in her hand. It was the price of her entire history, the sum total of her displacement. In her room, the scent of pine resin and oiled leather still lingered, a phantom of her father's presence. He had been her whole world, her mentor and her compass. While other girls were learning social graces, Alara was learning the difference between a rip-cut and a cross-cut. She learned to read the story of the land in its contours, to understand the language of stone, and to trust the quiet certainty of a well-made tool. He had bequeathed to her not money or property, but something far more durable: competence. A fortress of skill and self-reliance that no one could ever sell out from under her. She packed a single canvas satchel. There was little she considered truly hers. A few changes of sturdy clothes, a whetstone, a small tin of her father's preferred lubricating oil. She carefully wrapped his tools in oilcloth, a set of chisels with worn hickory handles, a small handplane, a dovetail saw with teeth still sharp enough to bite, and last, the object she treasured most. It was a surveyor's plumb bob, heavy and solid, cast from brass that had been polished to a dull gold by a lifetime of use. It was perfectly symmetrical, its point a declaration of absolute truth. It hung from a braided leather cord, dark and supple from the oil of her father's hands. It was his anchor, his way of finding the true vertical in a crooked world. Now it was hers. She did not sleep that last night. She sat in the dark workshop, running her hand over the scarred surface of the workbench, where she had learned to measure twice and cut once. She could almost hear his voice, a low rumble of encouragement, guiding her hands. He had given her a gift more precious than any inheritance of land or money. He had given her the knowledge to build, to fix, to create. He had given her a way to make her own place in the world. As dawn broke, casting long, gray fingers of light across the silent tools, she slung the satchel over her shoulder. She did not look back at the house as she walked down the long gravel drive for the last time. She was leaving nothing of value behind. The journey was a blur of bus station depots and the endless, hypnotic roll of asphalt. She traveled west, toward the sun, toward the vast, empty spaces on the map her father had loved. She spoke to no one, her solitude a shield against a world that had suddenly become sharp and unwelcoming. When the bus route ended in a dusty, wind-scoured town that seemed to be clinging to the edge of nowhere, she got off. From there she walked. For days, she followed a dry riverbed, the sun a relentless hammer against the anvil of the sky. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a palette of ochre, rust, and bleached bone. It was a place that stripped away all pretense, that demanded resilience. With each step, she felt the life she had known sloughing off like a snake's skin, leaving something raw and new underneath. The city, her uncle, the sold house, it all felt like a story that had happened to someone else. Out here, there was only the crunch of her boots on the gravel, the heat on her skin, and the steady weight of the tool roll on her back. She arrived in the town of Redemption with less than $400 to her name and a powerful thirst. It was little more than a wide spot in a dirt road, a collection of sun-faded buildings huddled together against the immensity of the Canyonlands. In the county clerk's office, a place that smelled of dry paper and forgotten lives, a notice board was covered in yellowed flyers and legal postings. One, freshly tacked, caught her eye. It was a notice of a tax sale. The listing was for Lot 73, unsurveyed. The description was sparse and uninviting. Abandoned mining claim, presumed collapsed. Property consists of one dugout structure, condition unknown. Located at terminus of Widow's Grief Canyon. Access via washed-out service road. Sold as is. The minimum bid was $150. She overheard two old men talking by the water cooler. Widow's Grief, one chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. More like fool's folly. Nothing up there but rattlesnakes and bad luck. Whole place is unstable. Man who dug it disappeared back in the 30s. They say the canyon itself swallowed him up. Alara felt a strange pull, a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but a grim, quiet resolve. A collapsed dugout, a washed-out road, a place named for sorrow. It seemed fitting. It was a place no one else wanted, a place forgotten and dismissed, a place like her. The county clerk was a man named Henderson, with a soft paunch and eyes that held a permanent glint of dismissive amusement. When Alara approached his counter and pointed to the notice, he barely suppressed a smirk. "You want that one, missy?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "You sure? There's nothing there. Literally nothing. Just a hole in the ground filled with rocks." "I'll take it," she said, her voice steady. The transaction was brief. Henderson filled out the deed with a flourish, as if enjoying a private joke. He took her $150, counting it slowly, and handed her the official-looking document. "All yours," he said, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Enjoy the view." He turned away, already sharing a knowing look with one of the men by the cooler. The sound of their muffled laughter followed her as she pushed open the heavy door and stepped back into the blinding sunlight, the deed clutched in her hand. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like a chance. The journey to Widow's Grief Canyon took the rest of the day. The washed-out service road was little more than a memory, a faint scar on the land that she followed on foot. The canyon walls rose around her, sheer and imposing, layers of red and orange rock stacked like the pages of an ancient book. The air grew still, the silence profound, broken only by the cry of a distant hawk. When she finally reached the terminus, her heart sank. Henderson had not been exaggerating. The sight before her was one of utter desolation. A massive rockfall, a cascade of boulders and scree, had obliterated whatever had once been there. At the base of the cliff face, half buried in the debris, was the dark maw of a partial opening. It was not a structure. It was a wound in the earth. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The clerk's laughter echoed in her ears. She had traded the last of her money for a pile of rubble. For a long moment she stood frozen, the weight of her satchel and her choices pressing down on her. The sun began to dip below the canyon rim, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and orange. The temperature dropped quickly. She could not stay out in the open. Shaking off the paralysis, she moved forward, her steps careful on the unstable ground. She had to find shelter. It was the most basic imperative, the first rule of survival. The opening was smaller than it looked from a distance, a jagged hole fringed with the splintered remains of what might have been a doorframe. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust. She ducked inside, her eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom. The space was tiny, a cramped cave barely large enough for her to stand upright. Most of it was filled with the same rock and debris from the collapse. But in one corner, a small section remained clear. Above it, a massive, hand-hewn lintel of solid stone was wedged firmly into the cliff face, a testament to some long-dead builder's skill. It had held. This would be her shelter. It was not a home, not even a room, but it was a start. She unslung her satchel and began the methodical work of clearing the space. She used her hands, her boots, and a flat, sharp-edged rock as a makeshift trowel. She worked until her fingers were raw and her back ached, her movements driven by a primal need to impose a small pocket of order on the chaos. As she worked, a strange sense of calm settled over her. This was familiar. This was work. This was something she understood. By the time darkness consumed the canyon, she had cleared a small, level area, just large enough to unroll her bedroll. She ate a piece of dry bread and drank from her canteen, leaning against the cold, solid rock. The silence was absolute. She was utterly, completely alone. But for the first time since her father's death, the loneliness did not feel like a void. It felt like a foundation. The next few days were a blur of hard, repetitive labor. Alara's world shrank to the confines of the dugout and the rockfall that choked its entrance. She developed a rhythm, a cycle of work and rest, dictated by the sun. Each morning, she would rise at dawn and begin the arduous task of moving rocks. She was not just clearing the debris, she was assessing it, reading it. Her father had taught her that every stone has a grain, a weakness, a story. She saw the clean fractures of a recent break, the weathered surfaces of ancient falls. She saw how the water had run, how the frost had wedged itself into tiny cracks, and how gravity had inevitably won. She sorted the stones as she moved them, her mason's eye categorizing them by size and shape. Flat, stable pieces for a potential floor, large, blocky ones for a retaining wall, smaller, irregular scree to be discarded. It was mindless, backbreaking work, but it was also meditative. With each stone she moved, she felt as if she were clearing away a piece of her own internal wreckage. The grief, the anger, the sense of betrayal, they were being transformed into sweat and aching muscles, into something tangible and productive. It was on the fourth day that she found the anomaly. She was working deeper in the collapsed section, prying loose a large boulder that blocked what seemed to be the back wall of the original dugout. As the boulder shifted and rolled away with a deafening crash, it exposed a surface that was startlingly different from the rough-hewn cliff face. It was a wall of dry-laid stone. The pieces fitted together with a precision that spoke of immense skill and patience. There was no mortar, only the perfect, interlocking geometry of stone against stone. It was her father's craft, executed by an unknown hand decades ago. She ran her hands over the surface, feeling the cool, rough texture. The wall was a marvel of engineering, a retaining wall built to hold back the mountain itself. But as her fingers traced the seams, she noticed something odd. Low to the ground, near the center of the wall, was a single rectangular stone that did not quite match the others. Its color was a slightly different shade of gray, its surface less weathered, as if it had been sheltered or placed more recently. The seams around it were tighter, cleaner, with less dust and debris packed into them. It was subtle, something only a person trained to look for such things would ever notice. Her pulse quickened. It was an intentional difference, a clue. She retrieved her rock hammer and a thin chisel from her tool roll. Tapping the stone gently, she listened to the sound. It was different from the stones around it. Not a solid, dead thud, but a faint, hollow resonance. There was a space behind it. Her exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. She began to work with a focused intensity, using the chisel to carefully chip away at the tight seams around the stone. It was slow, painstaking work. She had to be careful not to damage the stone or the surrounding wall. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its descent, casting long shadows into the dugout. Her arms burned and her hands were cramping, but she did not stop. Finally, with a soft, grating sound, the stone shifted. She put down her tools and gripped the edges with her fingers, pulling with all her strength. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked. It moved slowly at first, then slid free with a whoosh of stale air. She stumbled back, the heavy stone block in her arms, and set it carefully on the ground. Behind it was a dark, square opening, a cavity deliberately hidden within the wall. The air that flowed out was cold and dry, carrying the scent of dust, metal, and time itself. Kneeling, she peered into the darkness. Her searching fingers found the rough, cold surface of a metal box. It was heavy, and she had to struggle to drag it out into the fading light. It was an old military ammunition box, made of thick gauge steel, its corners reinforced with riveted bands. It was sealed shut, not with a lock, but with a thick layer of hardened wax that had been poured into the seam between the lid and the box. It was an airtight, waterproof seal, meant to last for an eternity. Her heart was pounding in her chest, a frantic drum against her ribs. With her hammer and the pry bar from her satchel, she began to chip away at the wax seal. It was brittle, shattering into dark, resinous flakes. Once the seal was broken, she wedged the tip of the pry bar into the seam and leveraged it with all her weight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, groaning screech of protesting metal, the lid popped open. She stared, breathless, at the contents. The box was filled to the brim. On top lay a rectangular object wrapped in a thick, greasy layer of oilcloth. Beneath it, she could see the dull gleam of metal. She lifted the oilcloth-wrapped package and set it aside. Underneath were dozens of canvas bank bags, each tied shut with a length of thin wire. She fumbled with the wire on the nearest bag, her fingers clumsy with anticipation. It came loose, and she tipped the bag's contents into her palm. They were not rocks. They were coins. Heavy, golden coins, each one bearing the image of a striding Lady Liberty. $20 double eagles. She opened another bag, and another. They were all the same. The box was filled with them. A fortune. A life-altering, impossible fortune, hidden in a wall of stone in a place no one wanted. After a long, stunned silence, she turned her attention to the oilcloth package. She carefully unwrapped the stiff, sticky cloth. Inside was a leather-bound book, its cover embossed with the words, "Surveyor's Log." The leather was dry but perfectly preserved. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, the ink faded, but still legible. "My name is Silas Kane," the entry began, dated June 1934. "If you are reading this, then you have found my last will and testament, and you are either very clever or very lucky, or like me, you know how to read stone. I hope it is the latter." Ilara sat on the dusty floor of the dugout, the gold coins forgotten beside her, and began to read. The logbook was not just a collection of measurements and figures. It was a man's life. Silas Kane had been a mining engineer, a man who, like her father, trusted the earth and the precise language of mathematics. He and his partner had discovered a rich vein of gold in this very canyon, but his partner, a man he had trusted like a brother, had betrayed him. He had registered the claim in his own name, triggered a rock slide to seal the entrance, and left Silas for dead inside the mine. But Silas had not died. He had found another way out, a narrow ventilation shaft that opened high on the cliff face. Officially declared dead, he had lived in secret in this canyon for 5 years. He built the dugout with his own hands, shoring it up with the dry-laid wall. He had secretly worked a smaller, hidden offshoot of the main vein, hoarding the gold, coin by coin. He wrote of his profound loneliness, of the bitterness of his betrayal, and of the solace he found in the hard, honest labor of his work. "I have no kin to leave this to," he wrote in the final entry, dated 1939. "The man who wronged me is long gone, and I have grown old in this canyon. My only companions have been the wind and the stone. This gold is a curse to me, a monument to a stolen life. But perhaps for someone else, it can be a beginning. I leave it all to the one who finds it. My only request is this: do not squander it. Use it to build. Use it to create a life of purpose and peace in this place that was my sanctuary and my prison. The mountain provides for those who respect it. May you find a home here, as I never truly could. May this place, born of sorrow, bring you peace. I leave you my blessing." Tears streamed down Alara's face, the first she had shed since her father died. They were not tears of grief or self-pity, but of a profound, aching kinship with a man she had never met. A stranger, dead for decades, had understood her better than her own family. He, too, had been cast out, betrayed, and left with nothing but his skills. He had faced the void and filled it with meticulous, patient work. His story was her story. His legacy was now her purpose. She carefully rewrapped the logbook and placed it back in the box with the gold. She looked around the dusty, rock-strewn dugout. It was no longer a ruin. It was an inheritance. Silas Kane had left her more than a fortune. He had left her a blueprint and a blessing. The work ahead was immense, but she was not daunted. She was inspired. With Silas's resources and her father's knowledge, she would not just survive here. She would build. She would honor the legacy of the man who read stone. And in doing so, she would finally, truly build a home of her own. The discovery of the gold changed everything and nothing. The fundamental reality of her situation remained the same. She was alone in a harsh wilderness, with only her hands and her knowledge to rely on. The gold was not a solution. It was a tool, like the chisels and saws in her satchel. It was a means to an end, and that end was the vision that was now taking shape in her mind. A vision of restoration, of building something permanent and true out of the rubble of Silas Kane's lonely life and her own. She began the work in earnest. Her first task was to properly excavate the dugout. It was a massive undertaking, far beyond what she could accomplish with her hands alone. She needed better tools, timber for shoring, and supplies to last her through the long process. For the first time, she took one of the heavy gold coins from its canvas bag. It felt alien in her palm, a piece of a world she didn't belong to. In redemption, she found a man who ran a small freighting business. She sold him the coin for a fraction of its numismatic worth, receiving a stack of worn paper bills in return. The freighter, a wiry man named Gus, asked no questions. In this part of the country, privacy was a currency more valuable than gold. With the money, she bought what she needed from the town's general store: heavy-duty shovels, a pickaxe, rope, pulleys, lanterns, and kerosene. She bought bags of flour, beans, and salted pork. The store was run by a woman named Martha, whose sharp eyes seemed to miss nothing. She watched Alara load the supplies onto a sturdy handcart she'd also purchased, her expression unreadable. "That's a lot of work you're taking on," was all she said. "It needs doing," Alara replied, and that seemed to be enough. Back in the canyon, the real labor began. She used a system of levers and pulleys, anchored to a sturdy juniper tree, to move the largest of the boulders. She worked with the patient, methodical rhythm of a stonemason, understanding that brute force was less effective than finding the right leverage point, the perfect angle. Day after day, she cleared the rockfall, slowly revealing the full extent of Silas's original dugout. It was larger than she had imagined, a series of interconnected chambers carved deep into the rock. The collapse had only taken out the front section. The rest was intact, filled with the dust and silence of nearly a century. As she cleared the entrance, she began the critical work of shoring up the ceiling and walls. She bought heavy timbers from a small, independent lumber mill an hour's drive away, hauling them one by one in a beat-up old truck she'd bought for cash. She measured and cut each beam with painstaking precision, fitting them into place to support the tons of rock above. She was building a cage of wood inside the cave of stone, creating a space that was safe and secure. It was carpentry born of a mason's caution, and it was rock solid. Her frequent trips to Redemption for supplies did not go unnoticed. The town was small, and a stranger, a young woman working alone up in widow's grief, was a source of quiet speculation. But no one bothered her. There was a code in these remote places, a respect for solitude and self-sufficiency. Her quiet determination and the sheer scale of the work she was undertaking earned her a grudging respect. One day, she brought a broken star drill bit to the town's blacksmith. The forge was a dark, cavernous building that smelled of coal smoke and hot metal. The blacksmith was a man named Abel, built as solidly as the anvil he worked at. His arms were corded with muscle, his face permanently smudged with soot. He looked at the broken bit she handed him, then looked at her calloused hands. "Broke it on granite," she stated, not a question. He grunted, a sound of affirmation. "Happens. You want it retempered?" "And the tip redressed. I need a sharp, durable edge for the new holes." Abel's eyebrows rose slightly. Most people wouldn't know the terminology. He took the bit without another word and thrust it into the glowing heart of the forge. He worked with a focused, economical grace, his hammer blows ringing out with a clear, musical rhythm. When he was done, he quenched the glowing metal in a barrel of oil, sending up a plume of acrid smoke. He handed it back to her, the new tip a perfect, sharp cross. "That'll bite," he said. He charged her a fair price, and as she left, she felt his eyes on her, a gaze that was no longer just curious, but respectful. Another time, she was visited by Jedediah, an old trapper who lived a solitary life in the surrounding hills. He appeared at the edge of her camp as silently as a shadow, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of the desert sky. He didn't speak. He simply stood and watched her for a long time as she carefully set a new stone lintel above the entrance to the dugout, using her father's brass plumb bob to ensure it was perfectly level. He watched her check her work, make a minute adjustment, and check it again. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. The next morning, she found a brace of fresh rabbits hanging from a tree near her camp. There was no note. None was needed. It was an offering of respect from one solitary, competent soul to another. Martha, the shopkeeper, began setting things aside for her. A new shipment of sturdy canvas, a well-made axe head, a box of candles that burned longer and brighter than the cheap ones. "Figured you could use this," she'd say, her tone matter-of-fact. It was not charity. It was an investment in a person she had come to see as a fixture, someone who was adding to the sparse community, not taking from it. The antagonist's defeat, when it came, was quiet and deeply satisfying. One afternoon, the county clerk, Henderson, drove his dusty sedan as far up the washed-out road as he dared. He walked the rest of the way, a smug look on his face, clearly expecting to find her living in squalor or long gone. He rounded the final bend in the canyon and stopped dead. Where there had been a pile of rubble, there now stood a structure of remarkable beauty and solidity. The front of the dugout was no longer a jagged hole, but a handsome facade of expertly laid stone that blended seamlessly with the cliff face. A sturdy, planked door made of dark, oiled wood was set into a perfectly square frame. A stone chimney rose from the side, a thin curl of gray smoke rising into the blue sky. A small, cleared patch of earth was neatly tilled, ready for a garden. It was not a hovel. It was a fortress, a home. Elara was on a ladder, chinking the seams in the new stonework with a mixture of clay and sand. She saw him standing there, his mouth slightly agape. She paused, her trowel in hand, and met his gaze. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The evidence of her labor, her skill, and her triumph was all around him. Henderson's face flushed a dull red. He turned without a word, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving only a cloud of dust behind. The laughter she had heard in his office that day was finally, completely silenced. The seasons turned. Summer's fierce heat gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The dugout was transformed. Inside, the rough stone walls were clean. The floors were level and paved with smooth, flat stones she had pulled from the riverbed. She had built a fireplace, a bunk, and a sturdy workbench where she laid out her father's tools. It was a space that was both a shelter and a workshop, a reflection of her own nature. She had found Silas's hidden vein, a thin ribbon of rose-colored quartz, shot through with glittering gold. She took only a single, beautiful piece of the quartz, leaving the rest undisturbed. She placed it on a small shelf she had built above her bunk. It was a memento, not a resource. One late autumn, the sky turned a bruised, greenish gray. The wind began to howl through the canyon, a low, mournful sound that promised violence. The radio crackled with warnings of a massive storm system, a once-in-a-generation deluge moving in from the west. Elara was not worried for herself. She had built her home with the knowledge of a surveyor and a mason. She had studied the high water marks on the canyon walls, carved the drainage channels around her home, and reinforced every timber and stone. She was high above the canyon floor, anchored to the bedrock. She was safe. The storm hit with a terrifying fury. Rain came down, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The dry creek bed at the bottom of the canyon became a raging, muddy torrent, carrying boulders and uprooted trees with it. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar. For 2 days, she remained inside, the fire crackling in the hearth, the storm raging outside her solid wooden door. Her home, built of stone and skill, did not tremble. It held. When the rain finally stopped and a watery sun broke through the clouds, she emerged into a changed world. The canyon floor was scoured clean, the road to redemption completely gone, washed away by the flood. Knowing the town was in the floodplain, she packed a bag with medical supplies, rope, and food, and began the difficult, treacherous journey downstream. Redemption was devastated. The creek had crested its banks and swept through the main street. Buildings were flooded, their foundations compromised. The bridge was gone. The town was cut off and in a state of shock. But its people were resilient. They were already at work, digging out, helping neighbors. Elara did not wait to be asked. She found Abel, the blacksmith, trying to shore up the wall of Martha's general store, which was threatening to collapse into the receding water. "You need a better anchor point," she said, pointing to a solid rock outcrop on the other side of the street. "And a block and tackle. We can use the weight of the forge's old flywheel as a counterweight." Abel looked at her, then at the wall, and saw the simple, brilliant logic of her plan. He just nodded. "Get the rope." For the next 3 days, Elara worked alongside them. She was a quiet, tireless force. She used her knowledge of leverage and structure to help stabilize the most damaged buildings. She organized teams to clear debris. She used her own funds, converting another of Silas's coins through Gus the freighter, who had found a back way in over the high mesas, to buy desperately needed supplies of medicine and clean water. She worked without fanfare, her competence her only introduction. The people of Redemption, who had once viewed her as a strange outsider, now saw her as one of their own. She had been tested with them, and she had proven her worth. She had earned her place not through conversation, but through common cause and shared labor. In the aftermath, as the town slowly began to rebuild, Alara took a single, perfectly square stone she had cut herself and carried it to a high ridge overlooking Widow's Grief Canyon. There, under a lone, twisted juniper tree, she built a small, simple cairn. It was not a grave marker, but a monument, a tribute to Silas Kane, the man who had turned his sorrow into a sanctuary. It was a quiet fulfillment of her debt to him, a promise that his legacy of skill and resilience would endure. A year passed. The scars of the flood began to heal, both on the land and in the town. Alara's home was complete. The dugout was no longer just a shelter. It was a testament to her journey. The garden she had planted flourished, providing her with fresh vegetables. A small workshop she had built against the cliff face housed her forge and tools. She had found a measure of peace that she had never known, a deep contentment that came from self-sufficiency, and a profound connection to the place she had built with her own hands. One evening, she sat on the stone porch she had built, watching the last rays of the sun paint the canyon walls in fiery colors. The air was cool and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. She was cleaning her father's brass plumb bob, polishing the worn metal with an oiled cloth until it shone with a soft, warm light. It represented her past, the foundation of skill and truth he had given her. Inside, on the small wooden shelf above her bed, the plumb bob would later hang. Next to it sat the piece of rose-colored quartz from Silas Kane's hidden vein, its crystalline structure catching the lamplight. One was an inheritance of knowledge, the other an inheritance of fortune. Together, they represented the two pillars upon which she had built her new life. They were symbols of guidance from two men she had never known in the same space, but who had both, in their own ways, saved her. She had come to this place with nothing but a handful of tools and a legacy of competence. The gold had been a miracle, a catalyst that had made the work possible, but she knew, with a certainty that was as deep and solid as the bedrock beneath her feet, that the gold was not the real treasure. The true inheritance had been the knowledge in her head and the strength in her hands, passed down from her father. That was the fortune that could never be spent, the wealth that could never be stolen. Looking out over the quiet canyon, her canyon, she felt a profound sense of belonging. She had not been given a home. She had made one. She had not been welcomed into a community. She had earned her place in it. The $150 she had spent on a worthless, forgotten piece of land, an act of desperation that had been mocked and dismissed, had been the single greatest investment of her life. It was, without a doubt, the best money she had ever spent.